Now, a couple of questions. I know you've been very generous with your time, Jay. Final questions. I need to ask you about Anthony Fauci, because he's almost kind of been revered as the second coming of Christ in the United States in many ways by a lot of people. But he hasn't exactly been a rock of consistency either. Now, I don't know the veracity of this video, but I think it's true. I saw that last March he was talking about masks, saying how, they weren't that effective to use. And then I think it's just a month ago, he recorded saying that we should be using more than one mask, maybe one or two masks and things like that. But he's become this kind of cult figure in the United States. And he's now, of course, Joe Biden's chief medical advisor. And he still is director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. What are your thoughts on Dr. Has he done well, if you were grading him?
So I have on my bookshelf a textbook for Harrison's Internal Medicine, where he was one of the chief editors. I've respected him from the first time I learned about him in medical school, and so it's been to me a great disappointment to see how poorly he's performed in this epidemic. I think if I had to identify you've identified the lack of consistency, the sort of like tailoring of the message to meet the political needs as opposed to like what the science is saying. I mean, there's some aspect of that you could criticize him on. To me, the worst things have been his absolute blindness to the harms of the lockdown. Right? He doesn't seem to see that these policies that he's arguing for have these devastating consequences. There's no hint of that in almost anything I've seen him say. And I don't understand it. I mean, it seems like to me that should be foremost in the mind of any public health official providing advice to governments or anyone else about this. So I think that to me is probably the single biggest failing of his that I've identified.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say equally, Ireland's chief medical officer, I'd put him in the same bracket. My word of the year for 2020, it wasn't quarantine or lockdown or COVID, it was monomania. And it just coincided with I was reading Crime and Punishment, and that was the kind of big word in Crime and Punishment, well, the monomania that the main character had. And actually, something very interesting at the end of Crime and Punishment, where this pandemic comes out of, or this virus comes out of Asia and infects the world, and it put men against men. This was all written towards the end of the book, and I just thought, well, this is exactly what's happening. When was that written? In 1880 or whatever? But yeah, I certainly agree with this. Not to look at the bigger picture, and that's been my frustration with this. When I explain my point of view, and people just don't seem to understand, and I don't know why.
Funny to think about Fauci as Raskolnikov, I guess. I mean, it's fine. Yeah. I think I agree with you. This monomania is really a central problem, right? Like, we've forgotten that there are many, many other important difficulties in public health, priorities in public health that we ought to be thinking about now. And to just let that go for a full year or more is a abdication of responsibility on the part of Tony Fauci. I say one other specific thing that I think he's failed at, is specifically in his role as the head of NIAID. So the head of NIAID has it's basically it helps set the agenda for research in infectious diseases. And this is a success. Just to give the devil his due, is he did prioritize vaccine development, which was a good idea. Obviously, it's paid off some dividends here. But he didn't, for reasons I don't understand, didn't prioritize the testing of other treatments for the disease that could have been useful early, right? So of course there was this whole political mess around hydroxychloroquine, but there are other ones, ivermectin, fluvoxamine, a whole series of other drugs that are cheap and widely used, and I don't know if they work yet. And that's a problem. Like, the NIAID should have already run large-scale trials of these things that look promising in other settings. Instead, they have fallen down on the job. We've done very little in the way of these kinds of large scale evaluations of these kinds of early treatments. We should be further along there than we are, and that falls on Dr. Fauci as head of the NIAID.